hadn't thought about the cabin in a few years. Not seriously, anyway. It had come up in passing, like when I drove north or when I had too much to drink and my thoughts drifted into places I didn't want them to go. But I never planned on seeing it again. That road, that part of the state, it was part of another life. One I thought I was done with. It was early October of 2022 when I made the mistake of heading up to the Upper Peninsula. I was 41 then. Not young, not old. Just in the middle, stuck between trying to move on and still carrying too much from the past. My name's Rick, by the way. I was born and raised near Grand Rapids, Michigan. Worked in construction most of my life, but I was doing contract surveying by then, which kept me traveling. Some weeks I loved the silence of it. Others, it just felt like running. The job I got that week was in a small town called Ironwood, not far from the Wisconsin border. The client owned a few hundred acres and wanted a property line confirmed before putting up fencing and maybe clearing a new access road. I'd been up that way once before, back when my ex-wife lived in that cabin, Claire. She bought that place in 2016. We were married for a few years before that. Things fell apart slow and quiet the way they sometimes do. No screaming or cheating or betrayal. Just distance, like two boats drifting farther every year until you look up and can't even see the other anymore. She stayed in the UP after the divorce. Said it made more sense for her to be closer to her dad, who had some land outside Wakefield. I went back south and promised myself I wouldn't look back. But on that drive north in 2022, my GPS decided to take me through a side route off Highway 28. I could have stayed on the main road, but traffic was backed up from construction outside Marinisco. I didn't think twice when the map rerouted me, just followed it. 10 minutes later, I realized exactly where it was taking me. The road twisted through a stretch of thick woods, darker than it should have been for that hour of the afternoon. I knew every bend, even though I hadn't driven it in 6 years. Gravel crunched under the tires, and the pine trees pressed in on both sides. And then, just past a rise in the dirt road, the cabin came into view. It looked the same. That shocked me more than anything. Same brown paint, same tin roof, same broken porch railing I always meant to fix. The woods had grown in a bit thicker around it, and there was moss on the north side where sunlight never touched. But otherwise, it was like time hadn't moved. I slowed the truck. Not to stop, just to look. I told myself it was just curiosity, but my foot eased off the gas, and before I knew it, I was pulled over on the shoulder with the engine idling. No car in the driveway, no lights on. A few dead leaves blew around the base of the steps. It looked empty. I should have kept going. I don't know what made me shut the truck off and get out. Maybe I wanted closure. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Maybe I just wanted to know if she was still there. Not Claire necessarily, but the feeling of her. What we had, what we didn't have. The air was colder than I expected when I stepped out. That Upper Peninsula chill that cuts through your coat no matter how thick it is. Everything smelled damp. Wet earth, pine needles, the bite of fall decay. I crunched over to the base of the driveway and stopped. Hands in my jacket pockets, just staring. No mail in the box. No signs of fresh tire tracks. The windows were dark and a little fogged over on the inside, like the cabin had been shut tight for a long time. I told myself I was just going to take a quick walk up to the porch and look through the window. Just once. 5 minutes. Then I'd go. My boots scraped over gravel as I walked. The closer I got, the heavier everything felt. Not just in my body, but in my head. Like every memory I'd buried came back up all at once. I reached the porch. The steps creaked just like they always did. Still missing that third spindle on the right-hand side of the railing. The door was closed the way I'd expected. But when I tried the handle, it turned. I shouldn't have been surprised. Claire never believed in locking doors out here. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Not rot or mold, just closed up air, stale and heavy, like the air had been trapped inside too long. The light through the windows was dim, filtered by tree cover and the slant of the sun. Dust danced in it. The place hadn't changed much. Couch still there, bookshelves still full, a few jackets hung by the door. A rusted old cast iron pan sat on the stove, just like always. There were signs that someone had been there not too long ago. The calendar on the wall was turned to August. A few dishes in the drying rack, but the silence was thick and deep. No radio, no humming of a fridge, no sound of someone moving in another room. I didn't call out, didn't even breathe loud. I just stood there, listening, watching. Then I noticed something strange. The pictures were gone. Claire used to hang a ton of pictures in the hallway. Her parents, us back in 2015, a few of her hiking trips. Every one of them had been taken down. Just empty nail holes in the paneling. I moved closer and saw the outlines where the frames used to hang. Faint rectangles where the wood hadn't faded. That's when I should have left. Instead, I walked down the hall. The bedroom door was open. The bed was stripped bare. Just a mattress with a crumpled blanket on top. The closet was empty. The drawers were open and half full, like someone had packed fast and messy. In the bathroom, the mirror was cracked. Not shattered, just a long split across the middle like it had been hit hard once and left that way. Toothbrush cup was gone. Soap dish still had a sliver of old bar soap in it. The rug was soaked. I crouched and touched it. My fingertips came back wet. It hadn't rained in days. I turned to leave. That's when I noticed the attic door was open. It was barely visible, just a square hatch in the ceiling with a cord hanging down. The ladder had been pulled halfway out. Something about it felt off. The ladder had never stuck out like that. Claire never used the attic. She was terrified of mice. I backed down the hallway, past the pictures that weren't there anymore, and back into the living room. I didn't know what I was looking for. My skin felt tight, like the air was closing in, like the silence was watching me. Then I heard a sound, not loud, just a shift, like weight moving upstairs. A creak, not from the wind, from footsteps. I froze. Every part of me wanted to bolt, but I stayed still, staring up at the ceiling. Then something dropped, a soft, quick thump, like a small object falling to the floor above. That was it. I turned and left, out the door, off the porch, back down the gravel drive. I didn't look back until I got to the truck. My hands shook as I fumbled the keys. When the engine finally turned over, I saw movement in the upper window. Just a shadow, but it moved. It leaned, like someone had been watching me the whole time. I peeled off that shoulder fast, sped down the road, dust flying behind me. Didn't slow down until I was 5 miles out and back near the main highway. I didn't go to the job that day. Called the client and made up an excuse. Drove 2 hours south and got a motel room in Watersmeet. Locked the door and stayed there until morning. The next day, I called a buddy of mine who used to work for the county up that way. Asked him if he'd heard anything about that old cabin. Said I used to know the owner and thought she might have moved. He got quiet. Told me it had been sold the year before, to a man from out of state. Said the guy didn't stick around long. Said something happened up there. Wouldn't give details. Just said the man moved out after a few months and left the place wrong. That's the word he used. Wrong. I never drove past the cabin again. Never asked more questions. Whatever I saw or almost saw that day, I didn't want to know the rest. But sometimes, when I'm in a quiet place, I still think about it. The attic door open, the wet rug, the missing photos, the shadow in the window. Claire was long gone. I checked. She'd moved out of state 2 years earlier, married again, had a baby. Her new life was somewhere warm and sunny, but the cabin, it wasn't empty. Someone was still there, and whatever they were doing, I had no business seeing it. It wasn't my place anymore. It never really was. And I thank God I didn't take one more step up those attic stairs. My name's Michael Derry, and I was 36 when this happened. I've been working in construction for most of my adult life, but I burned out after a bad accident on a site in Leeds. Took a beam to the shoulder, messed me up for months. After I recovered, I didn't go straight back. Instead, I took time off. Thought I'd go off the grid for a bit, get away from the noise. That's when I remembered my Uncle Tom's cabin. He passed away in 2016, left the old place to my mom, but she never did anything with it. She didn't even like going up there. Said it reminded her too much of him. I asked her if I could stay there a few weeks. She said sure, gave me the keys, warned me that the road might be rough and the electricity spotty. The cabin was in Northumberland, near the Scottish border. Nearest town was probably Hexham, but the place was deeper inland than that.
Proper conticida.
I loaded up my pickup with food, a few tools, sleeping bag, some clothes, and headed north in early May. The drive took nearly 6 hours. By the time I got there, the sun was starting to go down, stretching out long shadows across the farmland. The cabin sat alone at the edge of a wide field, behind a collapsed stone wall and an overgrown dirt path that cut through tall grass. It was small, just 2 rooms, main area and a back room that used to be my uncle's. Outside, it looked rough. The wood had gone gray in places, and there were signs that wind and rain had battered it over the years. But it stood solid. The door still locked, and the windows weren't broken. Inside, it smelled stale, dust, old timber, something earthy underneath. There was a single bed frame with no mattress, a wood-burning stove, shelves with tools, and a busted armchair covered in cobwebs. I cleaned up a bit, aired the place out, and set up my sleeping bag on a camping mat in the back room. The stove worked once I cleaned the ash out and lit it up with dry kindling from a box by the door. No phone signal.
No Wi-Fi.
I was completely cut off. That first night was peaceful. Too peaceful. No cars. No people. Just the wind in the grass and the occasional hoot of an owl. I didn't even hear crickets. I lay awake a while, staring at the low ceiling, listening to the sounds of the cabin creaking gently with the wind. I finally drifted off when the stove's warmth filled the little room. The first couple of days were just what I needed. I cooked simple meals, chopped some firewood with a rusted axe I found outside, and walked the nearby fields. There were old trails I remembered from childhood visits, and I followed one that led up a small rise where you could see the valley stretching out under the big northern sky. There were no other houses nearby, just miles of hedgerows, sheep fences, and the distant hum of wind turbines. Occasionally, I'd see a fox or a badger in the evening, but otherwise it was just me. On the 4th day, I noticed something strange. I was out near the edge of the field, checking a dry stone wall that had half collapsed from age. I found footprints. Not mine, they were too fresh, too wide, and too far apart. Big boots like steel toes. They came out of the tall grass from the north and stopped about 10 feet from the cabin, then doubled back the way they came. The dirt was soft enough to leave clear imprints. I stood there for a minute, staring down at them, trying to work out when they'd been made. It had rained lightly the night before, and these prints were sharp, no signs of rain softening. That meant they were from that morning, or maybe even the night before, but I hadn't heard anything. I walked back to the cabin, checking the door and windows. Everything was locked. Nothing had been moved inside. I even checked the small pantry to see if food was missing. Everything was as I'd left it. Still, I couldn't shake it. That night, I propped a garden rake by the inside of the door. If anyone tried to come in, I'd hear it fall. I also stacked 2 metal pans near the window ledge so they'd clatter if knocked. Nothing happened. But I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing little sounds. Shifts in the wood, tiny creaks, things that could have been mice, but I didn't know for sure. On the 6th day, I walked north across the field, toward where the footprints had come from. The land rose and dipped, mostly covered in wild grass and thorns. After maybe half a kilometer, I found a thin trail, not wide enough for a car, more like something used by sheep or deer. It was faint, but it led into a patch of scrubby woodland, bare, twisted trees, thin underbrush. I followed it for maybe 15 minutes and then stopped dead. There was a camp, not a proper one, more like a spot someone had been using. A black plastic tarp tied between trees, a dented kettle on a bed of rocks, and several bits of trash scattered around. Empty tins, a boot with no laces, some plastic bottles, even an old ragged sleeping bag half covered in leaves. The fire pit was cold, but there were signs it had been used recently. Charcoal still fresh. No moss had grown on the tins. Whoever had been staying there, it hadn't been long ago. I didn't touch anything, just looked around quietly, then backed away. I didn't want to alert anyone if they were nearby. Back at the cabin, I felt uneasy. I kept thinking about how close that camp was, maybe a half-hour walk, and I hadn't seen or heard anyone, but they'd come right up to the cabin a few days ago, just walked around, then left. Why? I decided to pack my gear up that night and sleep with my boots on. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft sound outside. Not wind, not rain. A slow, careful crunch of grass, like someone walking. I sat up and held my breath. The sound stopped. I waited, then a creak. The old wooden step outside. I didn't move. I reached slowly to my right where I kept a crowbar beside my sleeping bag. My heart was hammering in my ears. I didn't hear the door open, but I saw the shadow move across the small crack under it. Just a faint interruption in the moonlight from outside. Then silence. Minutes passed. Nothing. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up slowly and stepped toward the door. I gripped the crowbar in my right hand and flung the door open. Nothing. Just night air and the grass blowing gently. But something was off. To the left, the metal pans I'd stacked were gone. I stepped out, scanned the yard, and saw them, lying flat on the ground about 10 feet away, like someone had lifted them off gently and tossed them. That was the moment I realized this wasn't random. Someone had been watching me, maybe since I arrived. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At sunrise, I packed everything into my truck and left. But before I pulled away, I walked out to the shed behind the cabin one last time. I hadn't gone in there all week. Inside, it smelled worse than the cabin, mold, rot, damp tools. But in the far corner, behind a pile of old wood, I found something that made my stomach turn. A stack of flattened cardboard boxes. Under them, cans of food, water bottles, a plastic tub filled with wrappers, and a coat. A heavy, green work coat that hadn't been there years ago. It was muddy, torn at one shoulder, and looked recently used. And next to it, a phone.
No battery.
Just the shell of an old Android. I backed out, locked the shed, and left. I drove straight to a petrol station near Hexham and called the police. Told them what I'd found, squatters, I guessed. They took my details, asked me to wait. I told them where the cabin was, explained the signs, the camp, the coat. I never went back. A few months later, my mom told me the police had gotten in touch. Said someone had been living rough in that area for at least 2 years, maybe longer. An ex-farmhand with mental health problems. Had gone missing from a nearby property in 2021. Had been seen once or twice by farmers in the area but never caught. They figured he'd been hiding out, moving from one old barn or cabin to another. They found the campsite, found more signs, bones from small animals, knives made from scrap, maps marked with circles. They didn't say if he'd hurt anyone, but they said I'd been lucky to get out when I did. One officer told my mum the coat I found had blood on the inside, dried into the lining. I never asked more after that. I still think about that week. The cabin, the silence, the feeling of being watched. I think about those footsteps, the careful way the pans were moved, the shadow at the door. It was no ghost.
No monster.
Just a man. Someone broken, alone, and dangerous. And I had no business being there. I haven't been back to the countryside since. I stay in cities now. Crowded places. Places with noise and lights and people. Places where if someone's watching you, at least you'll know. It happened back in 2014, during a short break I took after leaving a warehouse job in Bristol. I was 32 at the time, single, and not in any sort of rush to get another job. I had saved up a bit, not loads, but enough to live easy for a couple of months if I was careful. I didn't want to stay in the city. I needed space. I needed to get away from people. So I booked a small cabin up in Northumberland, near the Scottish border, tucked deep into the woods just outside a place called Kielder. It wasn't a fancy getaway. It wasn't a rental through some company. I found it on an old online forum I used to browse. A man there said his uncle had a small wooden cabin he no longer used, and he was renting it out cheap to help cover taxes. I messaged him, he seemed normal enough. Said it was basic, no electricity, just a gas heater, a wood-burning stove, and a well for water. I figured it sounded perfect. Just peace and quiet. I didn't want phone signal or internet. I wanted to sit still for a bit. I took the train as far as Hexham, then a local bus, then finally met the man's cousin who gave me a lift the rest of the way. He was in his 50s, quiet. Just pointed at things as we passed them, the reservoir, the trails, the dead ends. Said the cabin didn't get visitors much and that I'd have the woods to myself. The track leading to the place was narrow, filled with ruts and rocks. He had a battered Land Rover that handled it like it had been driving there for years. The cabin itself wasn't much from the outside. Just a simple structure, dark wood, slightly slanted roof, moss on one side. One window in the front, one on the side. A rusted chimney poking out the back. There was a small shed a few feet off to the side, locked with a thick old padlock. The cousin said not to bother with it, just tools and junk in there. Then he handed me a metal key, told me he'd be back in a week to check in on me, and left. Inside the cabin, it was just as simple. A narrow bed against one wall, a small table and chair, and an old gas heater beside a blackened cast iron stove. There were a few shelves with dusty jars of lentils, oats, and tea. A tiny sink with a hand pump attached to the well. A single lantern hung from a hook. It was cold, quiet, and exactly what I wanted. The first few days passed easily. I hiked during the mornings, brought some books, and spent the afternoons reading by the stove. At night, the silence was almost crushing. No cars, no people, no hum of lights. Just the occasional creak of wood or the soft scratching of something outside. That sort of thing doesn't bother you at first. You expect it in the woods. Animals move around. Trees settle. Wind shifts. But by the fourth night, something changed. It was well past midnight. I had fallen asleep and woke up needing the toilet. I used a bucket inside the cabin since the outhouse behind it was just a hole with a cover, and I didn't feel like stumbling around outside in the dark every night. I was pouring the waste out behind the cabin into a little trench someone had dug long before when I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It wasn't a sound that made me turn. It was the feeling, like someone was watching. I looked out past the shed, across the faint clearing that led into the trees, and I saw her, a woman. At first, I wasn't sure if my eyes were just playing tricks on me. I stood still for a long time, my breath visible in the air. She was maybe 30 feet away, half hidden behind a tree. I couldn't see her clearly, just the outline of her face, pale in the moonlight. Her body was mostly hidden behind the trunk, but I could see her arm. She wasn't moving, just standing there completely still. I froze. My first thought was that maybe it was someone camping nearby, just walking around. But she didn't move, didn't speak, didn't act like a normal person who might say something like, "Sorry," or "Hi," if you startled them in the woods. She didn't flinch or shift her weight. She just stood there, watching. I backed into the cabin and locked the door. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the chair with the lantern burning, heart thudding in my chest, ears tuned to every creak and noise outside. But I didn't hear anything unusual.
No footsteps. No knocks.
Nothing. By sunrise, I told myself it had just been my imagination. Maybe a trick of the light or an animal that looked human for a moment. The next day, I tried to distract myself with a long hike. I walked out toward the edge of the forest, followed a logging road for miles, then looped back through a different trail. I didn't see anyone.
No tents.
No signs of people. Just woods, birds, and the occasional rusted can that had been left behind years ago. It helped a bit. I felt more settled when I got back. That night, I left the lantern on again, but I managed to fall asleep eventually. I woke around dawn, a soft noise outside the cabin. Not loud, just a sort of scraping sound like something brushing the wall. I didn't open the door right away. I waited, listening. The sound stopped after a few seconds. When I finally stepped outside, I found scratches along the lower edge of the cabin, below the window. Not deep, but long and curved, almost like someone had dragged their nails across the wood, or something had. I walked around the whole cabin, but saw no footprints. The ground was dry, so that didn't mean much. Still, it made my stomach twist. I checked the padlock on the shed. Still locked. I thought about calling the cousin, but I didn't have signal and there was no landline. The next night was colder. I stacked the stove and settled in with one of the books I brought. Tried to ignore the strange feeling in my gut. But sometime after midnight, I woke again. The room was cold. I must have let the stove go out. I sat up, wrapped a blanket around myself, and that's when I heard it again. The same sound, a scraping, brushing noise. This time, closer. I crept to the window and looked out. She was there again. This time, closer than before, standing just 10 feet from the window in the clearing. Her face was thin, her clothes loose and dark. She didn't look like someone out for a walk or camping. Her hair was long, tangled. I could see her more clearly now. Her skin looked dry, cracked. Her eyes wide, unblinking. She was barefoot. I stepped away from the window and grabbed the small hatchet I'd been using to split wood. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I just held it in both hands and waited. I didn't sleep again. When daylight came, she was gone. I searched the clearing.
No footprints.
No signs anyone had been there, but the shed had been touched. I could tell. The lock was still on, but the door was slightly ajar, like someone had forced it and then tried to close it again. That afternoon, I opened it. Just tools, like he said. A rake, a dull saw, a rusted spade. But there was a folded tarp on the ground that I was sure hadn't been there before. It was damp, stained. Underneath it, I found something I didn't expect. A rolled-up blanket. Thin, dirty, like someone had been sleeping on it. I checked every inch of the shed. Nothing else. No food.
No bags.
No ID. Just that blanket. I closed the shed and didn't lock it this time. If she had forced it open once, she could do it again. Better she didn't break it entirely. I stayed inside that evening. I kept the fire going. Didn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard the front door handle rattle. Not knock, rattle, like someone was trying to open it quietly. I waited, breath held, heart racing. It stopped after a few seconds. Then I heard soft footsteps moving away. At dawn, I opened the door. The handle was smeared with something dark. At first I thought it was dirt, but when I wiped it with a cloth, it was red. Not bright like fresh blood, darker, dried. I checked the clearing. Nothing. I started packing. I was supposed to stay another 3 nights. I didn't care. I threw my clothes into my bag, stuffed in my books, left the food I hadn't eaten. I started walking. No mobile signal. No way to call a taxi. I followed the logging road, hoping to find someone, a signal, anything. It took me 3 hours to reach a ranger's hut by the edge of the forest. It was locked, but there was a map posted outside. I marked the route and kept walking until I got to a village. Fallstone, I think. Small, quiet. I found a pub, asked to use the phone, and called a taxi to take me to Hexham. I didn't go back for the rest of my stuff. I messaged the man from the forum when I got home. Told him something weird was going on at the cabin. He didn't respond. I sent 2 more messages over the next week. Still nothing. A few months later, I checked the forum again. His account was gone. Deleted. I tried to find the cabin on a map. Couldn't. I had no address, no coordinates. I hadn't marked it. It didn't show up on Google. I tried remembering the name of the cousin who dropped me off. Couldn't. I had no number.
No paperwork.
It was like the whole thing had never existed. I don't know who the woman was. I don't know how long she'd been living near the cabin. I don't know if she was sick, lost, hiding, or just broken in the head. But she wasn't just some hiker. I know that for sure. She watched me. She came close. She touched the cabin. She tried the door. She wasn't trying to scare me. That's what still gets to me. She didn't make noise. She didn't threaten me. She didn't smash a window or scream in the night. She just watched, patient, quiet, like she had all the time in the world. And I left before she ever ran out of it. I was 32 when I first went back to that place. It had been nearly 20 years since I last saw it. Tucked away in a patch of woods off a narrow road in eastern Kentucky, where my grandfather used to live. He died when I was 12, and I hadn't returned since the funeral. But something about that summer made me want to go back. Maybe it was a mix of boredom and a need to feel connected to something real, something raw. I had just quit my job in Lexington, packed up what I had left, and decided to disappear for a little while. The cabin seemed like the right place. The property technically belonged to my uncle, who lived in Oregon now and hadn't set foot on it in years. When I called to ask if I could stay there for a bit, he gave a casual okay. Said there was probably nothing left but raccoons and rot, but I was free to do what I wanted with it. I had no idea what I was looking for, but I packed up my old Ford Ranger with tools, some supplies, and drove the 4 hours out there alone. The cabin sat on a hill that overlooked a long stretch of wooded land. It wasn't deep wilderness, but it was far enough from civilization that you couldn't hear cars or see lights at night. There wasn't even a driveway anymore. I had to park along the gravel road and hike a half-mile through the overgrown trail with a machete and a pack on my back. When I finally reached it, the cabin was still standing, barely. The wood was dry and gray, the tin roof dented and streaked with rust, but the walls were intact and the front door still closed tight. The porch had collapsed on one side, and there were vines snaking up the walls like veins. But it was better than I expected. I didn't plan to stay inside that first night. I set up my tent outside and cleared a space in front of the porch for a fire. There was something about being out there again that felt both familiar and unsettling. I kept catching myself looking at the tree line, watching for movement, even though there was nothing out there but deer and wind. Behind the cabin, maybe 50 or 60 feet away, was the old graveyard. That's what my grandfather called it, though it was barely that. Just a small patch of land fenced off with iron posts and chain links. There were 6 or 7 headstones in there, all crooked and covered in moss. I remembered walking through it as a kid, reading the names and trying to guess how they died. My grandfather told me they were just family and locals, people from way back. I never asked more than that. I spent the first week clearing brush, chopping wood, and getting the cabin back in some kind of livable shape. I swept out the inside, patched some holes in the floor, and even got the old wood stove working again. There was no power, no running water, just a rain barrel and an outhouse a ways downhill. I didn't mind, felt honest. The nights were the worst. They stretched long and silent. No cell service.
No lights.
Just blackness and the sounds of the woods shifting and settling. On the third night, I started hearing footsteps outside. Not animal footsteps. Heavy, slow, human ones. I grabbed my flashlight and looked, but there was never anything there. I wrote it off as my imagination, a trick of the wind in the trees or maybe a raccoon in the leaves. But it kept happening. I'd hear them again around midnight, then again near dawn. Always slow, always circling. I started sleeping with my hatchet next to me and keeping the fire going as late as I could. The footsteps were never close, just right at the edge of hearing. But they felt deliberate. On the sixth day, I decided to really explore the graveyard. The grass was knee-high, and the fence was half collapsed. I climbed over and walked between the stones. The names were worn almost smooth, but I could make some of them out. Abner M. 1872 to 1911.
J-Télé.
1883 to 1926. Most of them died young. There was one small stone that looked like it had never been finished. It just said C, with no date. It didn't feel spooky so much as sad. Forgotten, buried and left behind like the cabin itself. I took some photos with the disposable camera I brought and spent the afternoon clearing brush around the fence. I didn't want the graves to disappear under weeds. Felt like the right thing to do. That night, the footsteps came again. Louder, closer. They stopped right outside the cabin door. I didn't move. I just lay there on the floor, my back against the far wall, gripping the hatchet with both hands. There was no knock, no sound of retreat, just stillness. Then, after what felt like a full minute, they started again, moving around the side of the cabin, down toward the graveyard. I didn't sleep at all. At first light, I went outside and looked for tracks. The ground was soft from the rain the day before. I expected to find boot prints, something, but there was nothing, just scattered leaves and damp dirt. I thought about leaving. I packed up half my things, loaded them into the truck, and sat there with the door open for an hour. But I couldn't make myself go. I told myself it was just some hiker messing with me. Or maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. Sleep deprivation, isolation. I went back. The next day, I followed a small path behind the graveyard I hadn't noticed before. It wound downhill through thick trees and ended at an old wire fence I didn't remember. On the other side was a clearing, and in the middle of it stood a single structure. A shed, maybe 10 by 10, with a slanted roof and no windows. I climbed over and approached it carefully. The door was held shut with a loop of wire. I unhooked it and pulled the door open. Inside was empty, except for an old wooden chair and a pile of blankets in the corner. There were food wrappers, an empty can of beans, a half-burned candle in a glass jar. Someone had been sleeping here. The air smelled of sweat and mold. I stepped back out and stood there a long time, listening. Nothing. I left the door open and walked back to the cabin slowly. The rest of that day passed in a kind of fog. I kept thinking of that chair, that pile of blankets. Who had been staying there? How often? Were they still around? That night, I stayed awake with the fire burning hot. No footsteps came, just wind. The next morning, I returned to the shed with a notebook. I wanted to leave a message in case whoever it was came back. I wrote, "I'm staying in the cabin. If you need help or food, Leave a note. I didn't sign it. I just left it on the chair. When I came back the next day, the notebook was gone. The blankets were gone too. But in the dirt, written in what looked like charcoal or soot, were the words, "Stay out." That was the moment I knew something was wrong. I felt it deep in my chest. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a lost hiker. This was someone who lived out here, someone who didn't want to be found. I didn't go back to the shed. I started keeping my axe on me all day, and every night I blocked the door with furniture. Felt silly, but I didn't care. The next 2 nights were quiet. Then came the third. At around 2 a.m., I woke to a scraping sound on the wall outside, low, near the ground, like someone dragging a stick along the boards. I didn't move. The sound circled the cabin once, then again, then a third time. I was sweating through my shirt, barely breathing. After the 4th pass, the sound stopped, dead quiet. I waited 2 hours before I even sat up. When I finally did, I moved to the window and looked out through a crack in the boards. At the edge of the trees, maybe 30 feet away, stood a man. He wasn't facing me. He was turned toward the graveyard, his back to the cabin, wearing a long coat, hood up, hands at his sides, just standing there. I watched him for 10, maybe 15 minutes. He didn't move. Then, slowly, he walked forward into the trees and vanished. I packed everything the next morning. I didn't care about pride or exploration or nostalgia anymore. Something out there wasn't right, and I wasn't going to find out what it was. As I hiked back to the road with my gear, I took one last look over my shoulder. In the grass near the graveyard, where I'd cleaned the week before, were fresh footprints, bare feet, deep and wide and scattered in a pattern that made no sense, like someone had danced in circles or wandered without direction. When I reached the truck, I drove nonstop until I reached Lexington. I called my uncle that night and told him the place wasn't safe. He said he'd send someone to board it up. Months passed. I tried to forget. I took a new job in a warehouse and started rebuilding a normal life. Then, one morning in the mail, I got a package. No return address, just a small cardboard box. Inside was the notebook I'd left in the shed, and nothing else. It was the fall of 2016, and I had just turned 37. I wasn't going through anything dramatic, no midlife crisis or emotional breakup. I just needed something of my own. After working as an HVAC tech for the better part of 16 years around Eugene, Oregon, I had saved up enough to buy a small patch of land about 2 hours southwest, close to the coast but buried deep in the forested ridges that ran between the ocean and the valley. No signal, no neighbors, no paved road. I bought the 5-acre plot online. Never saw it in person until I drove up there with my truck the following weekend. The land wasn't anything special, thick second-growth trees, tangled underbrush, steep inclines, but I didn't care. I didn't want to start a farm or rent it out. I just wanted a cabin, a real one that I built myself. I had no grand plans or architectural vision. Just a simple 12 by 12 box on a level stretch I found halfway up a narrow trail that veered off the logging road. It took the better part of 3 weeks to cut down the brush and clear it. There were days I came back scratched to hell, knees soaked, boots full of dirt. I worked during weekends, camping out of the back of my truck, dragging logs one by one to a makeshift staging area. The plan was to build the floor frame and maybe get some walls up before winter came full force. It was already raining most days by early November. Oregon gets that kind of wet that doesn't come all at once but settles in like a fog. Soaks into your bones, your gear, your plans. But I had the tools and the will, and I didn't really tell anyone about the project. Not my coworkers, not my family. That was part of the point. That weekend, the weather report said heavy rain Saturday night, possibly into Sunday. It didn't matter. I loaded my truck with the pressure-treated beams, plywood, my generator, and enough food and water to last me 2 days. I left early, around 5 a.m., still dark. I parked near the base of the hill and hiked everything up in shifts, soaked in sweat before the real rain even started. By mid-afternoon, I had the floor joists leveled and bracketed. The platform was solid, no bounce, no give. I screwed down the subfloor and stood back, proud for a second. Just a plywood box in the woods, but it was mine. That's when the first real rain hit. Not drizzle, not mist, real, slanting, gusting rain that came in sheets through the trees. The kind that turns the trail to mud and makes your tools slick in your hands. I had a heavy-duty tarp and rigged it up like a low roof from the nearby trees, sloping it down toward the back so the runoff had somewhere to go. I threw down a tarp inside the box and set up my gear, cooler, sleeping bag, folding chair. I was going to make a fire outside, but it was too wet, so I boiled some water on my propane burner inside the cabin platform, sitting cross-legged in the dark while the rain thundered on the tarp. I hadn't brought anything to do, no book, no radio, no phone service. I just sat there and listened to the wind hammer the woods. Something about that kind of isolation settles into you. You start to hear things even if they're not there. I'm not talking about ghosts or anything like that, just the real, weird noises of deep woods at night. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, something heavy moving through wet brush. Animals, probably, or the trees themselves shifting under their own weight. I heard one sound, just past midnight, that didn't feel like any of that. It was like someone stepping onto plywood, that dead, hollow creak that wood makes when it bears weight. I froze. There was nothing inside the tarp shelter but me, and I hadn't left the platform since I climbed in to sleep. I was sure of that. I listened hard, barely breathing. Nothing. Just the wind pushing through the forest and the relentless drumming of rain on nylon. I told myself I must have rolled over and shifted something under the tarp. Maybe a beam or tool I hadn't secured. I turned on my flashlight and checked around. Everything was where I left it. Still, I didn't sleep much after that. The next day was worse. The rain hadn't stopped, and I had planned to frame at least one wall, but everything was soaked. The boards, my gloves, the plywood, all saturated. Nails slipped, saw blades stuck, and my boots sucked in the mud so deep it felt like I'd never leave. But I forced myself to work. By late afternoon, I had the back wall framed and temporarily secured. I was drenched and exhausted, so I took a break, sat under the tarp, ate some jerky. That's when I noticed the drag marks. They weren't mine. About 10 feet behind the cabin, the underbrush was pressed down in 2 long grooves. Not deep like tire tracks, just twin smears, as if something heavy had been dragged across the forest floor. They cut through the ferns and moss and vanished into the trees. I didn't want to think too hard about it. Could have been a bear or someone hauling firewood. The logical part of me kicked in and said it didn't matter. But I kept looking at those tracks. That night, the wind picked up. The tarp strained against the ropes. I tightened them down, reinforced the anchor points with heavy branches. I could hear limbs snapping off trees in the distance, crashing to the ground with a thud. And then, again, something stepped on the plywood. This time, I felt the vibration. Just one step, then nothing. I laid there in my sleeping bag, staring into the dark, my flashlight clutched but off. I didn't want to spook whatever it was, animal or person. The rain drowned everything, made it impossible to hear footsteps beyond a few feet. After a long silence, I turned the light on and swept the cabin floor. Nothing, but the corner of the tarp near the front entrance was pulled back slightly. Just a flap, no more than a few inches. I hadn't left it like that. Something had looked in. The next morning, I didn't eat. I packed up my gear, loaded my tools, and hauled everything back down to the truck. The wall stayed, the floor stayed, but I was done for the weekend. I didn't go back for 2 weeks. When I did, something was off. The tarp was shredded, not slashed, more like pulled until the grommets tore out. The back wall had collapsed inward, the nails bent like someone had pried the frame apart with force. The plywood floor was scratched, not clawed, scratched, like someone had dragged something heavy across it over and over in long, lazy arcs. And the ferns behind the cabin? The drag marks were back, longer, deeper. I stood there for almost an hour just staring. I didn't know what to do. I hadn't told anyone where I was building. There were no homes nearby, no hikers that I'd ever seen. I considered calling someone, police maybe, but what could I say? Someone wrecked my half-built shack in the woods? Instead, I rebuilt. I told myself it had to be animals, that the wall had fallen in the wind, that the tarp had rotted and torn, that raccoons or a bear had pawed the floor looking for food. So I rebuilt. That weekend, I brought better gear. Motion lights, a game camera. I framed all 4 walls, anchored everything harder. Brought long screws, lag bolts, steel brackets. I drilled everything deep. By Sunday night, I had a skeleton cabin, walls up, tarp roof. I set the game camera to trigger on motion, facing the clearing. Then I went to sleep, this time with my hammer in my sleeping bag. The rain came again just after midnight, the kind of rain that swallows everything. And I heard it again, wood creaking, this time more than once. Step, pause, step. I sat up slowly, heart slamming. Step, closer. I fumbled for the flashlight, clicked it on. Nothing inside the cabin, but outside, near the edge of the tarp, the motion light triggered. And I saw something. Just a flash, less than a second. A shape at the edge of the clearing. Not animal-shaped. Human. Not moving. Just there. Then gone. The light clicked off. I stayed awake until dawn. Every sound exaggerated in the wet dark. When the sun came up, I checked the camera. Dead. Battery gone. I checked the batteries myself before setting it. That was it for me. I left everything but my tools and hiked out. The next day, I came back with a friend. I didn't tell him what happened, just said I wanted help finishing the roof. He noticed the scratch marks, the missing tarp. I blamed the storm. We worked fast, finished the framing, laid the roof panels, tacked up some siding. I didn't stay the night. He did. Next morning, I came back and found him waiting in the truck. Said he hadn't slept. Said someone walked around the cabin all night. Never saw them. Just heard footsteps on the plywood outside. That was the last time I went up there. I sold the land 2 months later. Took a loss. Didn't care. The buyer was a contractor from Medford. Said he wanted it for hunting. I didn't tell him anything. A year later, I drove past the old logging road. Curiosity got the better of me. I hiked in just once. The cabin was gone. Nothing left. No walls, no floor. Not even nails or scrap wood. Just ferns grown back. Drag marks, faint but there. Like something had hauled every piece away. Piece by piece. I never went back again. And I don't plan to. I was 35 when I decided to take some time off work in late October of 2017. I'd been working construction jobs in Flagstaff, Arizona, for nearly 12 years without much of a break longer than a few days. My body was tired, my head was foggy, and I knew I needed to get away. No phones, no emails, no cities, just quiet. An old buddy of mine from years ago, Marcus, had once told me about this small hunting cabin his uncle owned near the edge of the Kaibab National Forest, way off the beaten path, past some rough dirt roads and a dried-out stream bed. Back then I had dismissed it as too remote, but now it was exactly what I was looking for. I called Marcus and asked if his uncle still had the place. Turned out he did, but no one had used it in a few years. His uncle had moved to New Mexico, and the cabin had sat empty since around 2014. He said I was welcome to use it as long as I cleaned up after myself and didn't break anything. I loaded up my old Chevy truck with supplies: a rifle, a sleeping bag, canned food, 2 jugs of water, some tools, and a thick green tarp just in case the roof leaked. I packed a solar lantern, a battery-powered radio, and a little black and white notebook. I planned to stay 5 nights. The drive out there took nearly 5 hours. The paved roads turned into gravel roads, and those turned into narrow dirt trails barely wide enough for the truck. No cell service, no traffic, not even a mailbox in sight. Just junipers, pines, and dirt. I crossed an old dry creek bed Marcus had mentioned, then took a right up a bumpy slope surrounded by scattered boulders. The trees were thinner there, and I started to see signs of the property. An old wire fence, half collapsed, and a faded wooden post with a chain hanging from it. The cabin appeared slowly through the trees like something pulled out of an old photo. The wood was grayed and cracked. The tin roof looked intact but rusty. The porch sagged a bit on the left side, and the door leaned in its frame, but it was standing. About 50 yards behind it, a short ridge rose up, thick with dead pine and manzanita. It was perfect. I got the door open with some effort. It stuck near the top but gave in with a solid push. The inside smelled like dust, old wood, and mouse droppings. Sunlight pushed in through the 2 side windows, hazy and soft. The place was just one big room. A cot against the far wall, a small iron stove in the corner, a work table under the front window, and a shelf nailed to the wall above it. I swept the place out, wiped the cot with a towel, and unrolled my sleeping bag on top. The first night, I lit a small fire in the stove using some leftover kindling I found in a box near the hearth. It was quiet, too quiet almost. No wind, no birds, just the soft ticking of metal as the stove warmed. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a strange sound. It wasn't loud, just wrong. A light tapping, almost like fingernails on wood. I sat up in my sleeping bag and held my breath. Came again. 3 short taps, then nothing. I thought maybe a branch had fallen or something was rubbing against the cabin. I stepped out with my flashlight. The cold slapped me instantly. My breath fogged the air. I swept the beam across the trees, the ridge behind, the dry grass. Nothing, but something felt off. The silence was heavy, unnatural. Even out in the woods, you expect to hear bugs, an owl maybe, a rustle of small animals. There was none of that. I went back inside and shut the door tight. I slept light the rest of that night. The next morning, I found something strange in the dirt just outside the porch steps. A print, not a boot, not a paw. It looked almost like a human foot, bare but wrong. Toes longer than they should be, the arch too low. It was half faded, like it had been left sometime before sunrise. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a mountain lion dragging a foot. I knew better, but I didn't have a better answer. The day was quiet. I hiked a few miles out, saw no one, heard nothing. I read a bit in that notebook and carved some small sticks into stakes just to keep my hands busy. I boiled water for some ramen noodles and watched the trees shift in the breeze. Night came early. The second night, it happened again. Just after 1 a.m., I heard something move outside the cabin. This time, it was steps. Slow, deliberate, crunching over dry leaves and gravel. I reached for my rifle and held it across my chest. I didn't move. I just listened. The steps circled around the cabin once, then twice. I could hear them clearly. Something walking upright. A deer doesn't do that. A coyote doesn't either. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I waited. Then silence. I cracked the door and looked outside. Empty. I stepped out and swept my flashlight. I caught something in the beam for a split second, just at the edge of the trees. It looked like a person, but too tall and hunched. His head was low, legs bent. The skin looked gray or tan, but I couldn't be sure. It was gone almost instantly, stepping behind a trunk. I ran forward with the flashlight and rifle. Nothing, not even footprints this time. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I thought about leaving. I had 3 days left, but I was already exhausted and uneasy. Still, the cabin was quiet in daylight. Nothing seemed out of place. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. Maybe I had scared myself more than I should have. That afternoon, I noticed something weird. Up on the ridge behind the cabin, about halfway up, I saw movement. I looked through my binoculars and spotted what looked like another cabin or maybe an old shack tucked behind the rocks and trees. I hadn't noticed it before. It was far back, maybe 300 yards away. No road led to it. The roof was caved in and the walls looked black with rot. I hiked up to take a closer look. As I got closer, I felt uneasy again. The trees up there were wrong, older, thicker, but not in a healthy way. Almost like they'd grown around something they shouldn't have. The air felt heavier. The structure wasn't really a cabin, it was more like a lean-to, but big. Maybe it used to be a hunting shack or someone's temporary home. The roof had collapsed and the walls leaned in. Inside, I found bones. Dozens of them. Some small rabbits maybe. Some bigger. Maybe deer. They were clean and dry, scattered in piles. And in the center, something worse. A circle made of stones, arranged carefully. Inside it, ashes, blackened wood, and a few feathers tied with old string. I felt sick. I turned and left, fast, back down to my own cabin without stopping. That night, I blocked the door with the table. I kept the lantern on until it died. I heard it again. This time, it didn't circle. Came to the front steps. I could hear it breathing. Not loud, but there. A raspy, shallow inhale. Then a slow exhale, like someone who'd been running. I didn't move. I sat on the cot with the rifle pointed at the door. The breathing stopped after a few minutes. Then a sound I'll never forget. It spoke. Not in words. Not really. It mimicked me. It was my own voice. I don't know how to explain it. It said nothing specific. Just low sounds, like someone trying to repeat the rhythm of how I talk. The rise and fall. But it was wrong. Hollow, like an echo through a cave. And it came from just outside the door. I stayed frozen like that until dawn. When the light came through the windows, I stood and moved the table aside. I opened the door and looked out. Nothing. But in the dirt right in front of the porch, a mark had been scratched. A long, crude line with a loop at the top, almost like an upside-down question mark. Deep, as if made with a claw. I packed up that morning. I didn't care if I had more food. I didn't care if I'd only stayed 3 nights. I didn't want to know what it was. I didn't want to see it again. I drove out fast, tearing through the dry creek bed and over rocks that scraped the underside of my truck. I didn't stop until I saw pavement. I didn't even return Marcus's call when he asked how the trip went. For a while, I didn't talk about it. Not even to my brother. I just tried to forget. But a few weeks later, something happened that brought it all back. I was home, back in Flagstaff. It was late, maybe past midnight. I was watching TV with the sound low, half asleep on the couch. I got up to use the bathroom, and as I passed the front door, I saw something outside through the peephole. Just a shape, tall, still. It was gone before I could open the door and look. But I swear, just before it disappeared into the trees at the edge of the road, it moved the same way. Bent legs, low head, too fast. I installed cameras the next day. Nothing showed up after that. No one ever came to ask questions. No damage, no theft, just silence. I don't know what I saw, but I've read things since. Stories, warnings, native tales about something that can wear your voice. Walk like you, sound like you, take pieces of you. I think I saw it out there near that ridge. I think it knew I didn't belong. And I think I got lucky. I'll never go back to that cabin. I still have that notebook, though. The last page is torn out. and I never tore it. I wasn't the type to get scared easily. I had grown up in the country, where nights were long and quiet, and the dark meant nothing more than the absence of light. I had camped alone before, but never stayed for more than a day or two. This time, I wanted to try something different. I wanted to spend a full week in a cabin tucked deep in the woods, with my dog, Ranger. He was a big mutt, half shepherd, half something else, but loyal as they came. He was the reason I felt safe enough to try this. The cabin was in northern Wisconsin, about a 4-hour drive from the city. It was old but solid, built in the early 70s, with weathered wood siding and a steep roof that shed snow in the winter. It sat just beyond a clearing surrounded by tall pine trees that stretched high, their needles thick and green even in late September. The forest floor was soft with fallen needles and damp moss. I arrived late afternoon, when the sun was low but still warm on my skin. Ranger sat in the back seat, panting lightly, eager to explore. The cabin smelled like old wood and earth, with a faint hint of cedar. The inside was simple: a small living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a wood stove, and a tiny bathroom. Upstairs was a loft with a bed and a small window that looked out over the trees. I unpacked my gear slowly, wanting to take my time. I set up the firewood, stacked neatly by the door, and made sure Ranger had plenty of water. We went outside for a walk around the clearing. The trees whispered in the wind, and the only sounds were Ranger's paws crunching dry pine needles and the occasional call of a distant bird. As night fell, the sky turned a deep blue-black, the stars coming out one by one. I lit a fire in the fireplace, the flames crackling and warm. Ranger lay close by, his head resting on my feet. The cabin felt peaceful, safe. I had planned to stay off the grid for a while. No phone, no internet, just me, the woods, and my dog. I was ready for quiet and maybe a little solitude. The first 2 days passed without incident. I explored the trails nearby, collected firewood, cooked simple meals over the stove, and read an old paperback I had brought along. Ranger was happy chasing squirrels and sniffing every inch of the forest. On the third night, something changed. It started with the sounds. Ranger's ears perked up while we sat by the fire. I heard it too, a faint rustling outside the window like branches snapping. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, but Ranger growled low in his throat, a warning I had learned to respect. I went outside with a flashlight, scanning the clearing and the edge of the forest. The beam landed on a set of footprints in the dirt, human footprints. They were fresh. The prints were big, heavy, as if whoever had left them wore boots. I followed them for a short distance before they disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep well that night. Ranger stayed alert, occasionally growling or standing at the door, ears forward. I kept my old hunting knife within reach on the table. The next day, I found more signs. The woodpile had been disturbed. A few logs shifted as if someone had leaned on them. The door, which I had locked carefully, had scratches around the frame. Deep, long marks that looked like claws or maybe a tool. Ranger's anxiety seemed to grow. He wouldn't leave my side. I tried to convince myself it was just a neighbor or another camper passing through. But this place was so isolated, and I hadn't seen a single soul since I arrived. The nearest cabin was a good mile away. That evening, I decided to stay inside after dark, keeping the fire burning bright. Ranger paced near the window, muscles tense. Around midnight, the rustling started again, louder this time. I could hear heavy footsteps circling the cabin, crunching through the fallen pine needles. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door just enough to peek outside. Nothing but shadows. I called Ranger and shut the door quickly, locking it behind me. I sat on the couch, heart pounding. Suddenly, I heard a sharp bang on the front door, like someone hitting it with a fist or a heavy object. Ranger barked fiercely, teeth bared. I stayed still, trying not to make noise. The banging came again, harder this time, then a pause, then silence. I waited for what felt like hours, but no more sounds came. Ranger was trembling beside me. The next morning, I found footprints again, this time circling the cabin multiple times. The door had fresh scratches and a deep dent in the wood. Someone had been trying to break in. I called the local sheriff's office from the nearby town. They told me they would send someone by to check in later that day, but that it was probably just some drunk camper or kids messing around. Still, they advised me to leave if I felt unsafe. I thought about packing up, but I wanted to see it through. I had come out here for a break from the city, from noise and people. I didn't want to run because of some troublemaker. That afternoon, I noticed something else. My food supplies had been moved. A can of beans I had left on the porch was open. The contents spilled on the ground. My pack of jerky was gone. That night, I stayed awake, fully alert, the knife gripped tight in my hand. Ranger stayed close, growling at every shadow. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps on the roof. Heavy, slow, deliberate. Someone walking over the shingles. I flicked on the flashlight and shone it upward. Nothing. No figure, no shadow. The footsteps stopped suddenly. I called the sheriff again, voice shaky. They promised to send a car right away. But by morning, there was no sign of them. No patrol car, no deputy. I packed what I could quickly and prepared to leave. Just as I was about to get into my truck, I heard a low growl from the woods behind the cabin. Ranger was alert, staring into the trees. Then I saw it, movement between the trunks. A tall man, thin, wearing dark clothes, eyes glinting in the morning sun. He didn't move quickly, just watching. I locked the truck and got inside, revving the engine. He took a step forward, then another, but stayed at the tree line. I didn't stop to look back. Driving away, I felt relief flood over me. Weeks later, I heard that there had been a series of break-ins in the area. Cabins ransacked, campers followed, sometimes threatened. No one caught the man, but the sheriff said they believed he was a drifter who had been living off the forest. I didn't go back. Ranger never seemed scared again, but I never forgot those nights. The quiet woods had turned dark and threatening. Sometimes the safest place isn't the one you build with walls and fire, but the one where you choose to walk away. Back in 2017, I was 34 years old and working as a seasonal ranger for the U.S. Forest Service. I'd been doing it for nearly 8 years at that point. It was the kind of job that made sense to me. Being outdoors, keeping an eye on trails, helping lost hikers, basic maintenance. I liked the solitude. I'd worked across several states, but that year I got a placement in the Payette National Forest in Idaho. I was stationed at a remote cabin called Finch Hollow Lookout, nearly 30 miles from the nearest paved road. Most of it wasn't even on a map you'd find at a visitor center. It wasn't one of those towers with the 360-degree views. Finch Hollow was an old ground-level fire cabin used in the 60s, sitting right at the edge of a ridge overlooking a basin. One road led to it, if you could call it a road. It was more like a series of wide dirt switchbacks winding through trees that were too tall and too close together. The cabin was primitive. One room, with stove, bunk, shelves with some canned food, and a water barrel that collected rain runoff. I had a handheld radio, a satellite phone, and a solar panel set up to keep a few things charged. The job was to monitor trail conditions, log animal activity, and stay on alert for fires. I'd file reports twice a day over the radio and send one email when I went down to the service shed every Saturday to check on the radio relay and use the landline. I was supposed to be there for 4 weeks, from late May into June. That first week was quiet. Cold mornings, long hikes, the sound of wind brushing through pine needles and nothing else. It was the kind of peace that made your ears ring. I'd spend most mornings hiking the nearby trails, noting blowdowns, checking animal tracks, and looking for illegal campsites or fire rings. Every evening I'd cook something simple, usually beans or rice or whatever canned crap I had with me, and I'd sit on the cabin's back step and watch the treetops shift under the sunset. The quiet didn't bother me, but on the 8th day, I noticed something off. It was around 2 p.m., and I was heading back to the cabin after hiking the ridge trail to mark a fallen tree. About 200 yards from the cabin, the trail dipped into a narrow bend. Just as I rounded it, I saw a boot print in the soft dirt, fresh and wide, probably a size 12. Not mine. I wear 9s. I stopped and stared at it for a while. It was the only one. No matching tread next to it, no staggered steps, just a single print pointed toward the woods, like someone had stood still for a while before stepping off trail. I scanned the woods. Nothing moved.
No barges, no squirrels, no rustling.
It was dead silent. I crouched next to the print and took a picture with my phone. Not for evidence or anything. I just figured I'd mention it in my log. Maybe a hunter had gotten lost and doubled back. But I hadn't seen any tire tracks at the trailhead, and you'd need a high-clearance 4x4 to even make it that far. It didn't add up. That night, I didn't sleep as well. Every sound outside felt closer. I'd hear a twig snap and hold my breath, thinking it was just a deer or wind, then realize I hadn't heard anything else for hours. 3 nights later, I found the first sign near the cabin. I always did a lap around the place before bed, checked the water barrel, cleared the wood pile, made sure I didn't leave anything out that would attract animals. That night, just past the barrel, I found a cigarette butt, not old, still had a little ash on the end, like someone had flicked it a few hours ago. I don't smoke, and the previous ranger, whose stuff I'd packed into a container the week before, didn't either. No other ranger had been up that season yet. I picked it up with a stick and dropped it in an empty coffee can I kept near the stove. There was no trash around.
No wrappers, no cans.
Just that one cigarette and a faint imprint in the mud near the eastern window. Not a full print, just enough to see the edge of a boot sole. Someone had been standing there, watching. I told myself it might have been a poacher, or someone who thought the cabin was abandoned. Still, I locked the door that night. I pushed the table in front of it, too. Didn't sleep. The next morning, I hiked down the switchback road to the old fire pit area about 2 miles downhill. There was a clear line of sight from that spot back up toward the ridge. I scanned for footprints and found nothing. No new trash, nothing out of place. I hiked the full loop trail, a 5-mile circuit through heavy timber, and didn't see anyone. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. By week 3, the mood had shifted entirely. I'd wake up to small things moved. Nothing major, just a pot turned the wrong way, or my hat on the bunk instead of the shelf. One morning, my field notebook was sitting open on the back step, like someone had read it. I hadn't touched it since the night before. There were no signs of forced entry. The door stayed locked. The windows were latched. I started rigging up small pieces of fishing line across the porch steps and under the window latches. Nothing ever broke the line, but stuff kept changing. Quietly, subtly. On the 19th day, I hiked back late. I'd followed a set of bear tracks deeper into the southern part of my zone, near an old burn scar from a 2003 wildfire. I returned to the cabin around 6:30 p.m., sweaty and sore. As I crested the ridge, I saw something that made my mouth go dry. The door was open, not swinging, not cracked, open wide like someone had walked in. I froze. I scanned the clearing. No movement, no sound. I drew my sidearm, which I rarely used, and stepped as quietly as I could around the edge of the cabin. I checked both sides. No one. I stepped inside. Everything was still there. My pack, my sleeping bag, my stove. But the chairs had been turned toward the window. Both of them, The can of cigarette butts was gone. I backed out, shut the door, and bolted it. That night, I slept with the gun under my pillow. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I used the satellite phone and called my supervisor. Told him someone was messing around near the cabin. I said it calmly, didn't overstate it, just told him I felt like someone was messing with my supplies. He asked if I wanted out early. I said no. I had 5 days left. I could handle it. I shouldn't have stayed. The next 2 nights were tense. I stayed up late, barely blinking, staring out the windows with my rifle on my lap. I didn't hear anything, didn't see anything, but that didn't comfort me. Then came the final night. It was cloudy, no stars. I had the lantern burning low and was trying to write out my final report. I had a good stack of notes to organize. At around 11:30 p.m., I heard it, a crunch, just one, outside the west wall. I turned the lantern off immediately and stood still. My eyes adjusted. I crept to the window and peeked through the edge of the curtain. First, I saw nothing. Then I saw movement, just a flicker. Someone ducking behind the water barrel. They didn't move like they were lost. They weren't looking around. They were crouched still, watching. Again, I stepped back, raised the rifle and shouted. Not words, just a loud bark to let them know I was inside and armed. I waited. Nothing happened. I flicked the outside flood with the switch by the door. A single solar-powered spotlight lit up the yard. No one. I opened the door, swept the clearing with the rifle and stepped out slowly. I walked to the barrel. Behind it, on the dirt, was a pile of photographs. They were of me, from different angles. Some were blurry, some were close, all taken from outside the cabin. One showed me reading on the back step. Another showed me walking down toward the ridge trail. One had me sleeping inside, my face partly visible through the window. That one nearly made me vomit. I scooped them into my bag and went back inside. I didn't sleep that night. I waited for sunrise. As soon as it was light enough to see clearly, I packed everything into my rucksack, slung the rifle, and hiked out. I didn't use the road. I bushwhacked straight south until I hit the trailhead road and kept going until I hit pavement. I flagged down a road crew near a maintenance shack and hitched a ride back to the station. I turned over the photos to the sheriff's department. They took it seriously. They sent deputies to search the area. They didn't find anything.
No cameras, no gear, no prints.
Nothing. 2 months later, a hunter found a crude shelter about 5 miles from the cabin. Just a lean-to made of branches and tarps, buried deep in the trees. Inside were more photographs, not just of me, of several different rangers who'd worked the area. Some dated back years, all taken from a distance, all silent, all still. They never found whoever built it. I didn't go back to field work after that. I switched to trail maintenance closer to towns and eventually left the Forest Service altogether. I live in Montana now, in a regular house with neighbors and streetlights and locked doors. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I heard something outside. Sometimes I check the window just to make sure no one's there. So far, no one has been, but I still keep the rifle loaded, just in case. I didn't expect the cabin to look so old. Not from the pictures I'd seen online. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, a place to clear my head and get some peace after the year I'd had. The year 1998 was almost over, and I was 32 years old, tired of the city noise, the endless routine, and the weight of my own thoughts. That's why I chose a cabin deep in the forests of northern Maine, far from any roads, phone lines, or people. The drive was long. After leaving the highway near a small town called Millinocket, the paved road ended and gave way to gravel. At first, the gravel was smooth and well-kept, But after about 10 miles, the road narrowed and turned rough, full of potholes and deep ruts from winter thaw. I kept my speed slow to avoid damaging the car. Pine trees towered on both sides, dense and dark green even in late November. The sun was already low when I arrived, but enough light remained to see the cabin clearly. The cabin sat on a small clearing beside a shallow creek. It was made of rough, weathered logs that had darkened over decades. The roof sagged slightly, and the windows were small, old glass panes with a faint layer of grime. The porch creaked under my boots as I stepped inside. Inside smelled of old wood, dust, and something faintly damp. The floorboards were uneven, and the fireplace held cold ashes. I'd come prepared, bringing a duffel bag with clothes, canned food, a small stove, and a flashlight with fresh batteries. The cabin had no electricity, no phone signal. I wanted that real quiet, real isolation. It had been years since I'd spent time away from the city. Here, it felt like I was stepping back into another century. The first night was cold and restless. The wood stove barely heated the room, and every crack in the logs seemed to let in the chill. Outside, the wind howled through the trees like a living thing. I kept the fire going, listening to the creaks and groans of the cabin settling, the occasional snap of a branch against the roof. I told myself it was all normal, the sounds of old timber and nature. Still, when I lay down on the thin mattress in the corner, the silence seemed heavy. The next morning, I woke early to frost on the windows. I wrapped myself in my jacket and stepped outside. The air was sharp and cold, my breath making little clouds. The creek beside the cabin was frozen over in places, the water still flowing beneath thin sheets of ice. I walked along the edge of the clearing, taking in the endless forest around me. Pine and fir trees stretched as far as I could see, their needles dark and dense. I decided to explore the area a bit. There was a dirt path leading into the woods from the back of the clearing. I didn't have a map, only a compass, which I kept clipped to my belt. I walked carefully, stepping over fallen branches and moss-covered rocks. The forest floor was soft with a thick layer of dead leaves and pine needles. I spotted animal tracks, deer, rabbits, maybe a fox. The woods felt alive but empty. After about an hour, I found a small hill with a clearing at the top. From there, I could see the cabin's roof peeking through the trees. It was a quiet view, calming almost. I took out my water bottle and sat on a rock, letting the silence settle around me. No planes, no cars, no people. Just the distant sound of wind and birds. That afternoon, I went back to the cabin and built a better fire in the stove. I cooked some beans from a can and ate cold bread. The warmth filled the cabin and my mood lifted a little. I unpacked a notebook and started writing, wanting to record this strange time away. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as the solitude stretched on. But as the day faded into evening, I noticed something odd. The silence felt different now, heavier, like the woods were holding their breath. I thought I heard footsteps outside, soft and careful. I looked out the window but saw only the swaying trees and dark shadows. Maybe an animal. Still, a knot formed in my stomach. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin. Every now and then, I heard a low thud outside, like a heavy branch falling. I checked the lock on the door, making sure it was secure. I turned off the fire, so no light would shine outside, and sat in the corner with my flashlight, waiting for morning. The next day, I found marks around the cabin. Scratches on the wooden porch posts, deep enough to show raw wood beneath the aged surface. I hadn't noticed them before. Strange footprints circled the clearing, too big to be deer with a heavy step. I checked my compass again and made a mental note not to wander too far. The days passed. I kept to a routine, exploring a little, gathering firewood, reading and writing inside. The isolation grew thick around me, My thoughts tangled like the underbrush outside. Sometimes, I thought I saw movement just beyond the tree line, a shadow slipping between trunks. No sound, just a glimpse of something that didn't quite belong. One evening, I heard something I never expected. A voice, low and distant. No words, just a human sound, but faint and muffled. It stopped quickly, like whoever it was realized I was there. I didn't answer or make noise. I stayed perfectly still, heart pounding. When I looked outside, there was nothing but dark trees. That night, I slept with the door locked and my boots by the bed. The wind was quieter, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every small sound made me jump. A branch breaking, a rustle in the underbrush. I wondered if I was imagining things. But the marks on the porch, the footprints, the voice, they were real. On the 5th day, I decided I wouldn't stay longer. The woods were no longer peaceful, but tense and strange. I packed up quickly in the morning, stacking my gear in the car. I took one last look at the cabin, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. The place was beautiful in a wild, raw way, but it held secrets I didn't want to uncover. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. A man, tall and still, watching me leave. The road ahead was rough, but I didn't slow down. I kept driving until the trees gave way to open fields, then to the highway and the noise of the city. Back in my apartment, the memory of the cabin stayed with me. The loneliness, the feeling of being observed, the silence that wasn't quite silence. I never found out who or what was out there in those woods, but I know now that some places don't want visitors, and sometimes it's better to listen and leave. I was 35 the first time I spent a week alone in my uncle's old hunting cabin up in the northern hills of Idaho. The place sat about 12 miles past a little town called Marble Creek, which you could miss if you blinked driving through. I'd been there a few times when I was younger, back when Uncle Jim used to take my brother and me up for deer season, but it had been over a decade since then. Jim passed away in 2013, and the cabin just sat there collecting dust. My mom inherited it, but she never went back. Too many memories, she said. By 2022, I was going through my own kind of reset. I'd gotten divorced a few months earlier, lost a job I hated, and was getting tired of city noise. I thought maybe a week alone, out in the woods, might clear my head. That kind of quiet, the kind that presses in on your ears when there's nothing but wind and birds, had always helped me think. I didn't go up there planning to hunt, really. I just wanted the space. The drive out was mostly uneventful. I left early on a Monday morning, just before sunrise, with everything I'd need packed into my old Toyota Tacoma. I had a .30-06 and enough rounds to take a deer or two if the opportunity came up, but it wasn't the priority. I had canned food, tools, a water filter, sleeping gear, and an old battery-powered lantern. The cabin had no electricity and no running water. That's how Uncle Jim liked it. There was a small creek nearby where we used to collect water in jugs, and a steel chimney for the fireplace. The place was remote, more than most people would be comfortable with. No cell signal after Marble Creek, just dirt roads, tall trees, and the long stretch of quiet that gets inside your head after a while. The first day, I arrived just after noon. The road up to the ridge had overgrown a little, but the truck made it fine. The cabin was just as I remembered it. Rough-hewn logs, moss growing thick at the base, and an old deer skull nailed to the edge of the porch roof. I took the padlock off the front door, which had rusted so bad it nearly snapped in my hand. Inside, the place smelled like dry rot and dust. I swept out a few dead mice, laid out my gear, and opened the windows to air it out. That evening, I sat out on the porch with a can of beans and a tin cup of black coffee. The air was cool and dry. It was late September, the kind of time when you can feel the season ready to shift. Leaves were starting to turn gold and orange, and the light filtered through the trees like a painting. I watched a few deer come up over the ridge around dusk, just silhouettes against the line of trees. It was peaceful, which is what I needed. But that night, I woke up around 2:30 to a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't loud, just enough to make me snap awake. I was lying on the cot near the window, and I heard it again. A short, dry scraping sound came from the side of the cabin, low to the ground. I froze. My brain went to raccoons or maybe a porcupine, even a bear, though it didn't sound heavy enough. I stayed still for a minute, holding my breath, listening. The sound stopped. No movement.
No footsteps.
Just silence. After 5 minutes, I figured it had moved on. I sat up slowly, grabbed my flashlight, and peeked out the window. Nothing. The woods were pitch black except for the moonlight bouncing off the creek. I didn't go outside. No point in wandering out there barefoot, half awake in the cold. I locked the door and lay back down. Next morning, I walked around the cabin to check. About halfway down the left side, near where the old firewood rack used to sit, I saw something odd. The dirt looked disturbed. Not footprints exactly. More like someone had dragged a stick or a piece of metal in a short line along the wall. It was about 4 feet long, angled, with a small pile of loose soil at the end. I crouched down and touched it. Dry. Not fresh, but not old either. Maybe an animal had nosed around. Maybe not. That day, I cut some firewood, walked the ridge a bit, and sat out near the edge where the land drops into a thick patch of pine. There was no sound of traffic, no distant hum of engines or planes, just birds, squirrels, and wind in the leaves. I cooked a can of stew over a little propane burner and sat on a log until it got dark. That night, it happened again. Around 1:40 in the morning, I woke up to a knocking sound. Not loud, but steady. Knock, knock, knock. It was deliberate. 3 times. Then silence. I sat up in the dark, heart pounding. My flashlight was within reach, and I turned it on. I didn't move from the cot. I listened. Knock, knock. 2 more. This time on the back side of the cabin. I stood, quietly, and grabbed the rifle. Not loaded. I'd left the rounds in the gear bag, but I held it anyway, more out of instinct than sense. I moved to the back window and aimed the light out. Nothing. Trees. Branches moving. A raccoon couldn't knock like that. Not with that rhythm. I waited 10 minutes. Nothing else. Eventually I got back into bed but didn't sleep well. In the morning I looked again. The back of the cabin had no steps or porch, just a narrow path and brush. I saw a mark on the bottom of the back door, about knee height, like something had tapped it with a blunt object. I walked out into the trees, checked the brush for signs. There were a few broken sticks, but nothing with shape or reason to it. I told myself it was probably just my nerves. The 3rd night was when things really shifted. It was just past midnight when I heard a new sound, something I hadn't expected. Breathing. It was outside, maybe 10 feet from the window, shallow and irregular, like someone trying to stay quiet but still gasping slightly. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, my heart hammering. The breathing stopped after a few seconds. Then came the soft crunch of leaves, very slow footsteps circling around the cabin. I stood in the dark, rifle in one hand, flashlight in the other. I waited until the steps faded away, then flicked on the light and swept the area through the window. I saw nothing, but I knew what I'd heard. By dawn, I was exhausted. I didn't leave the cabin that day. I sat by the fire, cleaning the rifle, loading it. I drank coffee until my stomach hurt. I thought about driving back down, but the idea of going outside, loading the truck, and heading out down that narrow road made my skin crawl. Whoever or whatever was out there, they knew where I was, and they were getting bolder. The 4th night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up, rifle across my lap, lantern dimmed. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps again, this time heavier, crunching through the pine needles toward the porch. Then a long pause. I sat there, frozen. I thought I saw a shadow move across the small slit of moonlight beneath the door. Then nothing, just quiet. But this time it didn't fade. It stayed quiet like someone was standing there, waiting. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there for what must have been 30 minutes. Eventually, I heard slow, retreating steps, deeper into the woods. By morning, I decided I had to leave. I packed my gear fast, keeping the rifle close. When I opened the cabin door, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. On the front step, laid out carefully in a row, were 5 small stones, each the size of a fist. They'd been placed with equal spacing, perfectly aligned. Not natural, not random. It was a message or a warning. I got in the truck and left without looking back. Back in Marble Creek, I stopped at the only gas station. The guy behind the counter asked where I'd been staying. I told him about the Ridge cabin. He gave me a look, kind of side-eyed, but didn't say much. Just nodded and handed me my receipt. When I asked if anyone else had places up near there, he shrugged and said, "Not for a while. I never went back to that cabin. I told my mom to sell the land or let it rot. I didn't care. To this day, I don't know who was out there. Could have been a drifter. Could have been someone living off-grid. Could have been a squatter who didn't want company. But they watched me. They came close. They left no tracks, no voice, no light. Just slow footsteps, tapping knocks, and quiet breathing in the night. And those 5 stones. Sometimes the scariest things aren't loud. They're patient. They wait. And if I'd stayed one more night, I don't think I'd be writing this." I was 34 the year it happened. This was in the fall of 2017, up in northern Michigan, somewhere along the edge of the Ottawa National Forest. I'd been going through a rough patch back then. Laid off, divorced, not much going right. My Uncle Greg, who I hadn't spoken to in years, called me out of the blue in September. He'd had a minor stroke and couldn't do much outdoors anymore. He told me I could use his hunting cabin for a while, get away from things, maybe help clear it out for winter. It was out in the woods, isolated, but it had running water and a wood stove. No cell signal, though. That was the deal breaker for most people. For me, it sounded perfect. I packed up a week's worth of canned food, bottled water, my dad's old .22 rifle, and drove 5 hours up from Grand Rapids. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. There was no one to tell. The turnoff to the cabin wasn't even marked, just a half-hidden gravel road off Route 64. The GPS lost me 10 miles out. From there, it was gut instinct and a handwritten map my uncle had mailed me. It was late afternoon when I pulled up. The place looked like I remembered. Weathered pine logs, tin roof, tiny porch with a broken railing, woods all around like a wall. I unlocked the rusted padlock on the front door and stepped inside. Dust everywhere. Smelled like old wood, cold ashes, and mouse piss. But it was dry. I opened some windows, let the air in. There were 3 rooms, main living area with a stove and couch, a small bedroom with a single bed, and a cramped kitchen with a hand pump over the sink. The outhouse was out back, maybe 30 feet into the trees. By nightfall, I had a fire going in the stove, my sleeping bag laid out, and a pot of beans heating on the metal burner. I sat on the porch with a blanket, watched the sky turn dark over the treeline. No traffic sounds.
No voices.
Just the cracking of branches in the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. I felt better than I had in months. I slept like a rock that night, deep and dreamless. The next morning, I started cleaning. The place was full of junk. Broken chairs, rusted tools, old hunting magazines, boxes of ammo for calibers I didn't own. I found a locked trunk under the bed, too, but no key. I didn't think much of it. Spent most of the day chopping firewood and stacking it behind the cabin. Saw a deer at dusk, just standing still in the tree line, watching me. It didn't run. I went inside after that. The third day, little things started to bother me. I noticed marks on the doorframe that hadn't been there before. Long, shallow scratches, maybe from an animal. I figured it was a raccoon or something trying to get in. That night, I heard something outside, heavy footsteps on the porch. I sat up in bed, heart racing, waited. The steps didn't come back. I wrote it off to wind or maybe the cabin settling. But I started checking the door first thing every morning. On the fourth day, I found more scratches and muddy prints on the porch steps. Not boots, not shoes, just bare feet. Big ones, wide with long toes. They led down the steps and vanished into the brush. I stood there for a while, staring at them. I don't know what I expected to feel. Fear, maybe, but it was more like confusion at first. Like I couldn't quite make sense of what I was looking at. Then I got this creeping feeling in my stomach, like when you realize you forgot to lock your car in a bad part of town. I loaded the .22 and kept it next to the bed from then on. I also dragged a metal shelf in front of the door before I slept. Not because I thought it would stop anyone, just so I'd hear it if someone came in. On the fifth day, I tried to hike out a few miles just to get my bearings, maybe catch a signal. I brought a pack, some jerky, a compass. I walked for hours but didn't find anything. No trails, no roads, just endless pine and birch. When I turned back, I noticed something strange. There were signs of someone else out there. A small pile of cigarette butts, fresh ones. A torn scrap of blue cloth hanging from a branch. A dead rabbit hanging from a tree, skinned, tied with fishing line. It hadn't been there on my way out. I moved faster going back. Got lost once, had to backtrack using the sun. I made it to the cabin just before dusk. The shelf I'd set against the door was knocked over. Nothing was missing inside, but things had been moved. My rifle was on the couch instead of by the bed, and one of my cans of food was open and half-eaten.
No teeth marks.
It had been opened with a knife. I sat there for a long time, holding the rifle, listening. No sounds but the wind. I didn't sleep that night. On day 6, I found the tree. It was maybe half a mile from the cabin, down a shallow ravine. It looked like someone had used it as a message board. Carved symbols in the bark, layers deep, some fresh, some old. They weren't letters, just crude shapes. A triangle with a line through it, a stick figure with no eyes, a spiral. Around the base were bones. Not big ones, maybe squirrels or raccoons, cleaned and stacked. There was also a pair of old glasses cracked in half. I didn't touch anything. I just stood there, staring at the tree, heart hammering like a drum. Something about it felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Like it wasn't just weird, but wrong. The kind of wrong that sinks down into your bones and doesn't let go. I went back to the cabin and packed. I didn't care that I'd only been there 6 days. I'd seen enough. I loaded everything into my truck, but when I turned the key, the engine didn't catch. Tried again. Nothing. I opened the hood. The battery cables were gone. Cut clean. Not chewed. Cut. I slammed the hood and backed away. I couldn't think clearly. I was sweating even though it was 40 degrees out. I locked the truck and ran back inside. Pushed the shelf back in front of the door. Loaded the rifle. Sat down by the stove and waited. Night fell like a curtain.
No mon.
Just black outside the windows. I didn't light the lamp, just kept the fire low, listening. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, careful, moving across the porch. The shelf rattled slightly, then nothing. For 2 hours I sat there, heart pounding so loud I thought I'd pass out. At one point, I thought I saw a face at the window, just for a second. Pale and still, then gone. The rest of the night passed in silence. Just the fire crackling and my breath. I didn't sleep, just waited for dawn. When the sun rose, I checked the truck again. The hood was open. The spark plugs were gone now, too. I went back inside, grabbed my pack, and decided to walk out. I didn't care how long it took. I was getting out of there. I left a note inside in case someone came looking, just in case. I started walking east using the sun and a compass. I moved fast, didn't stop to rest.
No brakes.
Just miles and miles of trees. At one point, I found an old trail, barely visible. I followed it. That's when I saw the cabin. Not my cabin, a different one. Smaller, older, looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Roof caved in, moss growing on the walls. But there were signs someone had been there recently. A tarp over the doorway, ashes in the fire pit, a deer skull nailed to the door. I didn't go inside. I backed away and kept moving. It took me a full day and a half to find the main road. I must have looked like a ghost. Filthy, wild-eyed, holding a rifle with shaking hands. A guy in a pickup pulled over and called the sheriff when I told him what happened. I gave a statement, told them about the cabin, the tree, the footsteps, the person or people out there. They nodded, took notes. A week later they called me, said they went out there, found the cabin. Nothing inside but some food and an old rifle. No signs of forced entry, no tree with bones, no second cabin, just forest, miles of it. I asked if they checked the truck. They said yes. Battery was there.
Cables fine.
No damage. They drove it back. They asked if I'd imagined it, maybe. Said sometimes isolation plays tricks. I hung up and didn't answer when they called again. I moved to Indiana that winter. Got a job at a warehouse. Kept my head down. Haven't been back to the woods since. I still have that .22. Stays under my bed. Loaded. Sometimes I think about the tree, the bones, the symbols. I wonder if someone still lives out there, just far enough off the trails to never be found. I wonder if they watched me the whole time, waited until I was alone, until they knew I couldn't leave. All I know for sure is this: something was out there with me, something human or close to it. And if I hadn't left when I did, I don't think I'd be writing this now. That cabin's still out there, somewhere in the pines. I don't care if I ever see it again. I was 32 years old when I found myself driving down a dusty, narrow road deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It was early October 2011, and the air had just begun to chill. The colors of fall were brilliant. The yellows, oranges, and reds of the maple and birch trees lining the path seemed almost alive against the dull gray sky. I was alone, and for the first time in months, I wanted that. No phones, no city noise, no people. Just quiet. I had heard stories about an old cabin tucked away on Pine Ridge, a place that nobody visited anymore. A relic left behind decades ago, forgotten by time. The cabin had belonged to a man named Harold Whitman, who had moved out sometime in the late 1970s after his wife died. Since then, the place had been left to the woods, the elements, and whatever else roamed the forest. I wasn't looking for ghosts or anything supernatural. I don't believe in that stuff. I wanted to see the cabin for myself, maybe write about it. I'm a photographer, and I'd been stuck on a project for months. Maybe the solitude would clear my head. The road became rougher and narrower. Gravel mixed with patches of dirt. Trees grew closer to the edges, their branches scraping the roof of my old Subaru. The sound of the tires crunching the gravel was the only noise except the occasional caw of a crow or the rustling of leaves stirred by a cold wind. After about an hour, the road ended abruptly in a small clearing. There it was, the cabin. It looked worse than I expected. The roof sagged in the middle, shingles missing, revealing dark wood beneath. The walls, once painted white, were now covered with moss and peeling paint. Some of the windows were broken or boarded up. The front door hung slightly off its hinges, creaking in the wind. I grabbed my camera and stepped out. The cold air bit my cheeks, and I pulled my jacket tighter. The ground around the cabin was uneven, covered in dry leaves, fallen branches, and patches of moss. It smelled damp but not musty, like the forest was swallowing the place slowly. I took a few pictures from the outside, close-ups of the peeling paint, the rusty nails sticking out of the porch, the broken window glass catching the weak sunlight. I wanted to be respectful. This was someone's home once. I moved to the front door and pushed it slowly. It groaned and gave way, revealing the dark interior. The air inside smelled old. Dust, wood rot, and something faintly sour, like spoiled food or stale sweat. The floor creaked under my boots. I switched on my flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing the living room. A collapsed sofa lay near the back wall, cushions torn apart by time and animals. On a small table, I spotted a dusty, cracked photo frame, the glass shattered. Inside was a faded picture of a smiling woman and a man, Harold and his wife, probably. I explored cautiously, stepping over broken floorboards and debris. The walls were covered with old wallpaper, faded and peeling. A few broken plates and rusty cans littered the floor. The fireplace was cold and filled with ash that hadn't been disturbed for decades. As I moved through the cabin, I noticed how still everything was. No animals or insects inside, no breeze. The silence was almost deafening. It made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't explain. The kitchen was a mess. The sink was clogged with leaves and dirt. The counters were covered in grime, and an old stove sat against the wall, rusted and useless. I found a cracked tin can of beans on the floor, long past its prime. The cold metal was sticky with rust. I looked around the small bedroom. A broken bed frame sagged in one corner, tangled with a dusty mattress. A closet door hung open, revealing empty shelves. On the floor, scattered papers and old clothes yellowed and torn. The bathroom was tiny, the toilet cracked and stained. The sink faucet was rusted and stuck in place. I saw an old, broken mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. My own reflection was distorted and pale in the weak light. I decided to check the back porch. Outside, the woods pressed close, the trees dense and dark. I noticed a faint path leading away from the cabin, almost hidden by fallen leaves and brush. Curious, I followed it. It wound through the trees and led to a small, overgrown clearing. There was a shallow grave, marked by a wooden cross that looked handmade and weathered. The name was hard to read, but I made out Margaret Whitman. The dates told me she had died in 1975. The spot felt heavy, and I suddenly understood why the cabin was left alone. Harold had lost his wife, and after that, the place had fallen into ruin. I felt a strange sadness, standing there in the quiet woods, the cool air brushing past my face. I turned back toward the cabin, but something made me pause. The woods had become darker and quieter. The wind stopped, and I felt eyes watching me. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling was real. A presence, maybe a person hiding, waiting. I told myself it was just nerves, the isolation playing tricks on me. Still, I quickened my pace back. When I got to the cabin, the door was now shut tight. I hadn't closed it. A chill ran down my spine. I tried the door, it wouldn't budge. I rattled the handle, but it was locked from the inside. That didn't make sense. I checked the windows. Most were boarded or broken, but none were open enough to slip through. No other doors. I felt a surge of panic. If someone had locked me inside the cabin, why? Was I being watched out there? Was someone in the woods? I looked for another way out, but found none. The back door was nailed shut. The cellar hatch was gone. The sun was setting fast. The clearing dimmed as shadows stretched over the trees. I was trapped. I sat down on the floor, breathing hard. My flashlight battery was low. I wished I had brought a phone, but I'd left it in the car for silence. I tried to calm myself. Maybe someone was just playing a prank or had come back to check the cabin. But who? I thought about shouting, but no one was close enough to hear. I decided to wait until dark and see what happened. Hours passed. The cold grew worse. I heard noises, twigs snapping, leaves crunching, low grunts far off. Maybe animals, maybe not. I didn't dare move from the spot. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Heavy, slow. They circled the cabin once, then stopped. I held my breath, heart pounding so loud I thought it would burst. Then came soft tapping on the window nearest me. A slow, deliberate tapping. I didn't look. I stayed frozen. After a long pause, the tapping stopped. I didn't sleep. I tried to think of a way out. At dawn, I tried the door again. This time, it opened. I stepped out cautiously. The forest was quiet, sun filtering through branches. I ran to my car, heart still racing. The keys were in my pocket. I jumped in and locked the doors. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. It looked like an empty shell again, but I knew something had been there. Back in town, I reported the incident to the local sheriff, but they said nobody else had seen or heard anything. I never went back to Pine Ridge. The cabin and the woods still haunt my dreams sometimes. Not because of ghosts, but because of the very real fear of being watched, trapped, and left alone in a place where nobody comes. I learned that some places carry a weight not from spirits or curses, but from the pain, loss, and secrets buried beneath their walls. And that, to me, is scarier than anything made up. It was the summer of 1998 when I first went to my friend Nate's grandma's cabin. Nate and I had been close since middle school, and he often talked about this old place deep in the woods near a small town called Mill Creek in northern Minnesota. His grandma owned the cabin, an old, creaky structure built back in the 1940s, which she hardly used anymore. She wanted to rent it out sometimes, and Nate's family often visited during holidays. That summer, Nate invited me to come along for a few days. I didn't think much about it then. Just a chance to escape the city heat and spend time in the woods. I had no idea how much that trip would stay with me for years. The cabin was about a 2-hour drive from Minneapolis. We left early one morning, with Nate's dad driving his rusty old pickup, the kind that rattled over every bump. The road was mostly paved but quickly turned into gravel and then dirt as we neared the forest. I remember the smell of pine and damp earth getting stronger the closer we got. The car windows were down, and the cool morning air mixed with the scent of wildflowers and moss. The drive ended at a narrow dirt path that led to a small clearing. There, the cabin sat, tucked between tall pines and thick underbrush. It wasn't large, maybe 600 square feet, built of rough logs with chinking cracked in places. The roof sagged a bit, covered in old green metal sheets rusty in spots. A thin trail of smoke drifted from the stone chimney. Nate's grandma must have started the fire early. I stepped out, feeling the soft dirt beneath my boots. The forest was quiet except for the occasional chirp of birds and the faint rustle of leaves. Around the cabin were scattered flower beds, mostly overgrown with weeds. A wooden porch wrapped around the front, with a couple of creaky rocking chairs that looked like they hadn't been used in a while. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke, old pine, and a faint hint of mothballs. The floorboards creaked underfoot. The main room was simple: a stone fireplace, a sagging sofa covered with a faded quilt, a small wooden table with mismatched chairs. The kitchen was just a corner with a small gas stove, a rusty sink, and open shelves filled with old dishes. There was a tiny bedroom with a narrow bed, a dresser with peeling paint, and a closet stuffed with moth-eaten clothes. The bathroom was a tiny room with an old clawfoot tub and a rusty sink. Everything looked like it had been untouched for years except for the fire, which kept the place from feeling completely dead. The first night, I slept poorly. The cabin's thin walls let in every sound. I could hear the wind shift through the trees outside, branches scraping against the roof. The old wood groaned as the temperature dropped. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate, but when I looked, there was no one there. The next day, Nate and I explored the nearby woods. The forest was thick with pine and birch, and the ground was covered in ferns and moss. We followed a faint trail to a small lake about half a mile from the cabin. The water was still and cold, surrounded by rocks and fallen trees. We swam for a while, then sat on the shore, skipping stones and watching the clouds drift. That afternoon, Nate's grandma arrived. She was a small, tough woman in her 70s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. She stayed only a few hours, cleaning the cabin and bringing fresh food. When she left, she warned us to lock the doors at night and be careful not to leave the lights on, as the cabin's old wiring was fragile. After she left, things started to feel off. I couldn't quite explain it at first. There was a heaviness in the air, a kind of tension I hadn't noticed before. The trees outside seemed darker, the shadows longer and deeper. At night, the silence was almost complete, broken only by occasional sounds. Twigs snapping far off in the woods, the distant hoot of an owl, the skitter of small animals in the underbrush. One night, around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. It was faint at first, a soft scraping like nails on wood. My heart quickened. I sat up in the narrow bed, straining to hear. The sound came again, from outside the cabin, near the porch. I swallowed hard and grabbed the flashlight I kept on the dresser. I moved carefully, trying not to make noise. When I opened the door, the beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness. The porch was empty. The forest beyond was black, nothing moving. I felt a cold chill and shut the door quickly. My hands were shaking as I locked it. I went back to bed but couldn't sleep. I kept imagining shadows moving just beyond the window. The next day, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was an animal or just my imagination. Nate said he hadn't heard anything and was calm about it. We spent the day fixing the porch steps and chopping firewood. The work was tiring but normal, grounding. But then, as evening fell, I noticed something strange. The firewood pile had shifted. Some logs were out of place, as if someone had taken a few and put them back clumsily. I mentioned it to Nate, but he shrugged it off. That night, the unease came back stronger. Around 2 a.m., I was awake again, this time with the feeling that someone was watching me. I heard footsteps, slow, heavy, outside, circling the cabin. The porch creaked under weight, and I could hear the faint brushing of branches against the walls. I stayed frozen, listening. The sounds stopped suddenly, as if whoever was out there had vanished. I wanted to believe it was a deer or a bear, but the footsteps didn't sound like any animal I'd heard before. The next morning, Nate and I found strange marks on the ground near the porch. Deep footprints, too large to be any deer or bear, and they seemed to circle the cabin. The prints were fresh, with broken twigs and crushed grass. I felt a cold dread settle in my chest. We decided to leave the next day, but that night the sounds grew worse. At around 11 p.m., the power flickered and went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, except for the firelight flickering from the fireplace. The silence was thick, broken by the snapping of twigs and a soft scraping noise again, this time coming from the back door. Nate tried to light a candle, but the matches were wet. We sat in silence, the fire crackling low. Suddenly, the back door handle rattled as if someone was trying to open it. We stared at the door, breath held. The rattling stopped, then started again, slower, more deliberate. I crept to the door, heart pounding, and peeked through the window. Nothing but darkness. I turned on the flashlight and shone it into the woods. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, just beyond the porch light's reach. But when I blinked, it was gone. We stayed awake until dawn, never letting the fire die. When the first light came through the window, I felt some relief, but the fear didn't leave completely. That morning, we packed quickly and left. The trip back was quiet. Nate didn't say much, and I was deep in thought. I wanted to believe it was just some stranger fooling around or my imagination running wild in the dark woods. Years later, I learned from Nate that his grandma's cabin had a strange reputation in the town. There had been reports over the years of people sneaking around the property at night, sometimes stealing firewood or supplies. Some locals said the woods nearby were used by hunters or campers who didn't always respect the land. Others whispered about someone living off the grid, hiding in the forest, watching from afar. But the most chilling detail Nate told me was that the police once investigated a series of break-ins near Mill Creek, but never caught anyone. The trails always went cold in those thick woods. No one knew who or what was out there. I never went back to that cabin. I still remember the weight of the darkness, the feeling of unseen eyes in the trees, the cold touch of fear creeping in when the lights died and the footsteps circled the porch. That trip taught me how real fear can be without any ghosts or monsters. Sometimes it's just the unknown, the people you don't see, the sounds you can't explain, and the quiet threat lurking just beyond the edge of the light. And sometimes that's enough. I was 38 when I decided I needed to get out of town for a while. I lived in Kansas City at the time, and between the constant noise, the daily grind at my job in industrial safety compliance, and the stress that came with a long and bitter divorce, I felt drained. I wasn't in any kind of mental breakdown or anything, but I was on the edge of something close to it. My doctor had warned me about stress, and I had started having short bursts of chest tightness and trouble sleeping. I figured a week or so in the woods might help me reset things. I didn't want a hotel, and I definitely didn't want a crowded campsite. I wanted solitude. I looked online for cabins that were quiet, off-grid, and as close to middle of nowhere as I could find. Most were too polished or had too many other people around. Eventually, I found a listing through a small rural website for a hand-built cabin in northern Arkansas, about 40 minutes from the nearest town and 3 miles off the nearest paved road. There weren't even real directions, just GPS coordinates and a warning that 4-wheel drive was highly recommended. It looked perfect. The pictures showed a small A-frame cabin next to a creek. It had a porch, a wood stove, and an outdoor fire pit. The owner, an old guy named Jim, sent me a scanned document with rules. It said to bring my own food, fuel, and batteries. The place had solar power and a radio for emergencies. He'd leave the door unlocked and the keys on the kitchen table. It was all very informal. I booked it for 10 days in early November. I brought a cooler full of food, a couple gallons of water, a backup water filter, 2 cans of gas, firewood, my sleeping bag, and a rifle. I wasn't planning on hunting, but I liked having it with me. You never know when you're that far from people. The drive down was uneventful. I passed through Springfield, cut across into Arkansas, then followed smaller and smaller roads until I was on a narrow gravel one that climbed through the Ozark Hills. The last few miles were nothing but winding dirt tracks. The trees were just starting to lose their color, and the air had a damp, earthy smell. When I finally pulled into the clearing where the cabin sat, I immediately felt better. The structure was rough but sturdy. Weathered wood, a mossy roof, and a stone chimney on one side. The creek out back burbled softly, and the nearest cell signal had vanished 10 miles ago. It was perfect. I carried my gear inside. The cabin was just one room with a loft above it, which had a ladder up to a sleeping area. The kitchen had a small propane stove and a table made from an old door laid over sawhorses. There was a locked cabinet with emergency supplies and a map of the area pinned to the wall. A pair of boots sat by the door, and I assumed they were Jim's. Everything had a smell like cedar and smoke. That first night, I built a fire in the stove and listened to the forest. No sirens, no car alarms, no phones. Just crickets and the creek. I read a little and went to bed early. It was colder than I expected, but my bag was warm enough. The second day, I hiked the area. The woods were thick and wild, mostly oak and hickory. I followed the creek for a few miles and found a spot where someone had made a primitive rock dam to pool the water. Probably an old fishing hole. I found no signs of recent human activity, no trash, no cut branches, no boot prints. That night, I cooked beans over the fire pit and watched the stars. By day 4, I was fully adjusted to the quiet. I spent my time walking, reading, and sitting on the porch. I had a small battery radio, and I'd turn it on each morning to check the weather. The signal was weak, but I could catch the local AM station out of Harrison if I moved the antenna just right. I kept my rifle on the wall hooks by the front door and checked it every now and then. It was that night when something changed. It was around 2:30 in the morning when I woke up. Not from a sound, but from the sudden awareness that I wasn't alone. That's hard to explain, but it was the kind of feeling you get when someone's watching you, except it was stronger. I laid still in my sleeping bag and listened. I didn't hear footsteps or voices, just the wind outside, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Eventually, I got up and climbed down the ladder from the loft. The cabin was dark except for the dying red glow in the stove. I pulled on my jacket and grabbed the flashlight from the table. I thought maybe some animal had brushed the cabin or maybe a raccoon got into the trash outside. When I stepped out onto the porch, the woods were dead silent. Not just quiet, silent. That strange, heavy silence where no animals are calling. Even the creek sounded distant. I swept the flashlight across the clearing. Nothing. I walked out around the side of the cabin and checked the trash bag I kept tied up by the back tree. Still sealed. I stood there for a few minutes watching the tree line. Something felt wrong, like I was being watched from the dark, but I couldn't see anything. Eventually, I went back inside, locked the door, and kept the rifle next to the bed. I didn't sleep much after that. The next day, I tried to brush it off. I told myself I was just jumpy from being alone so long. Still, I stayed close to the cabin and didn't hike as far. I checked the windows, reinforced the door latch, and cleaned the rifle, just in case. That night, I kept the fire going low and listened hard for any sounds. Nothing. On the 6th day, something was different. I found boot prints by the creek. At first, I thought they were mine, but when I matched them up, they weren't the same tread. Mine had a crosshatch sole. These were narrow and long with a lined pattern down the center. They had been made recently, maybe that morning. I followed them for a few yards, but they vanished near a slope of mossy rock. I checked the area in a circle, trying to pick up the trail, but the leaves were thick and damp, and the prints didn't carry far. It wasn't a hunter. No one comes that deep without a reason, and I hadn't heard a single gunshot all week. Whoever it was had come in quietly and left just as quietly. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in a chair near the window, rifle in my lap, eyes fixed on the tree line. The porch light was solar-powered and weak, and it barely reached past the first row of trees. At some point around 1 a.m., I heard it, a faint crunch of leaves, just once, then again. I turned off the lamp and crept to the front door. I listened hard. The steps were slow and spaced out, someone walking carefully. I stayed low and looked through the side window. I couldn't see anything, just shadows. Then I saw a shape. It was at the edge of the woods, near the spot where the trees start to thin. A figure, tall, thin, not moving. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark outline. They stood completely still, facing the cabin.
No flashlight.
No movement. I watched for what felt like a full minute. Then I blinked, and they were gone. Not like they ran, just gone. I scanned the whole tree line, but nothing moved. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn came, I packed my bag and walked the entire perimeter of the clearing. No tracks, no sign of anyone, but I knew what I saw. I don't get spooked easily, but this was different. It wasn't some lost hiker. It wasn't some curious neighbor. There were no neighbors. I thought about leaving that day, but I had 3 days left, and part of me didn't want to run. That may have been pride, or stupidity. The next night was worse. Just after midnight, I heard the doorknob rattle. Not loudly, just a soft testing click. I was already awake, sitting on the floor with my back against the stove. I froze. I didn't breathe. The door rattled again, then stopped. I stood up slowly. The rifle was in my hands before I realized it. I stepped to the door and shouted. I didn't even think, just shouted a warning. No answer. I opened the door fast, rifle raised. Nothing. The porch was empty, but on the ground, laid neatly across the welcome mat, was a dead squirrel. Its neck was broken, and the body had been placed there. Not dropped, placed. I kicked it into the bushes and slammed the door. I blocked it with the table and moved the ladder to the trapdoor that led to the loft. I stayed up there until morning, rifle across my chest. I left the next morning. I didn't clean the cabin. I didn't send Jim a message. I threw everything into my truck and drove. I didn't stop until I was 2 hours north, in a motel with working locks and cameras. I didn't sleep there either. I just stared at the ceiling. I never found out who that was. I told the sheriff's office in Harrison what happened. They took my name and said they'd look into it. I never got a call back. I doubt they ever went out there. I still think about it sometimes. The boots that weren't mine, the figure in the trees, the dead squirrel laid like a gift. Whoever that was didn't want to talk. They didn't want to be seen. They wanted to scare me, and they did. And the way they moved, the silence, the patience, it didn't feel random. I don't go to cabins anymore, and I haven't slept through the night since.